In this example, we're going to create some diagrams that show areas under the normal curve using Excel. And so let's start by creating a mean and standard deviation for our normal distribution. And let's say that in the first instance we want to create a normal distribution with a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, or in other words, a standard normal distribution. So let's have a column of z-scores with the idea here that we're going to try to create a span of values in z-score units that are likely to include the entire range of the area, or something close to the entire range of the area under the normal curve. And so that's roughly about 3.5 standard deviations below and above the mean. So I'll start with negative 3.5, and I'm just going to increment these units by units of about 1/10 of a standard deviation. So I'm just going to add 0.10 to this value to get this value. If you wanted a more fine-grained unit, you could make it 2 decimal places. You can add 0.01, but then you're going to have to make more of these values. And just for simplicity, I'm going to use 0.1. And so I'm just going to scroll, drag this down until I've got enough of these values that I've covered about positive 3.5 standard deviations. So that's about here. So now I've got z-scores ranging from negative 3.5 to 3.5. Which I can use to basically span most of the area under the normal curve. So now I'm going to use the z-score, and I'm going to work backwards to get the value of y. Let's call this y raw, our y raw score from our z-score transformation formula. And you can basically calculate that raw y score by taking your z-score and then multiplying it by the value of your standard deviation. And if you put that in parentheses, that's probably a good idea. And in addition to that, we're going to add the value of the mean. And so notice here that the mean is referenced by cell B1. I want to make sure to fix that point, so I'm going to put a $sign here. I also want to fix the point that includes the standard deviation that's in B2. And I do that because I want to pull down or drag down this entire formula. And I want this formula to be executed for every single one of these values. And so I want it to always point to this value and this value when I'm doing that. So I'm just going to put my cursor here in that little box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and double-click it. And I've got it for every one of these. So notice that here, these values are basically the same because a standard normal distribution is already expressed in z-scores. But if I, for instance, change these values, let's say I change this to like a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 5, well, these values are going to change. So going back to 1 and 0, these values generally tell us what the raw score is in certain standard deviation units. Okay, next I'm going to create some areas. And so I'm going to create some areas under the normal curve. So let's have an area 1 and we'll have an area 2. So let's call this area 2. Okay, so for each of these raw scores or z-scores, as they're stated right now, we're going to create an area under the normal curve corresponding to those. And we can use the Excel function normDist to do that. Now normDist takes 4 different arguments. The first is the actual raw score, or in this case the z-score. And the second is the mean. So I'm going to point it to here. But I want to make sure that this mean is always used when I drag down this formula. So I'm going to put a $sign here to fix the position of the mean. The third argument is the standard deviation, which is up here in B2. And again, I'm going to put a $sign because I want to fix that value. And the fourth argument is whether I want a cumulative distribution or not. The default is cumulative. I actually don't want a cumulative distribution in this case. So I'm going to put false. So now if I just, again, put my cursor in this little square at the bottom and double-click it, it'll drag it down, and it'll give me an area corresponding to each of these different values. Okay, for now, let's make the area of the second set of values 0. And again, if I just kind of click this down, it'll put a 0 for each one of these. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a graph. And so in order to do that, I'm going to highlight my areas. And I'm going to go up here to the Insert ribbon, and I'm going to insert a graph from the Charts area. And so I'm going to insert a particular kind of chart, an area chart. So I'm going to click OK. And notice that Excel creates a graph. I'm just going to drag this up to the top of the screen here so we can see it a little bit better. So notice that we have two areas. One is all zeros at this point, and another one is basically the area corresponding to the areas under the normal curve at this moment. Okay, so what we can do now is just make a few alterations to our graph. So first of all, we can click in this legend area, and then if we right-click, one of the options that will be given is select data. So we'll hit select data. And then when the next window pops up for our select data, we're going to click here in the edit version where it says horizontal categorical axis labels. And here we're going to select the values corresponding to our Y raw column. And so just make sure you hit all of them from start to finish. Click OK and click OK again. And so now when we go back to our graph, we notice that it ranges from negative 3.5 to roughly our positive 3.5. And so we've basically now changed this value. Okay, the next thing we can do is just change the look of our graph a little bit. And so what we can do is we can click inside this series. And then if we right-click it, one of the options is to format the data series. So we'll choose Format Data Series. And we're going to change the fill, the border color. And we're going to change the border color to black. And then we'll click Close. And so what that accomplishes is now there's a black border around this value. We can also change the color of this graph. So again, if we kind of go up to the top of the screen here where it says Home on the ribbon, we can change this value to a different color. Let's make it white. And we now see that this graph is a white color with a black foreground as an outline. Okay, so the other thing we can do is we can actually delete this legend. We don't really need it. But we can now use this diagram to shade different areas under the normal curve. And so let's say that we wanted to shade the area between a value of 0, or the mean in this case, and a positive standard deviation of 1. Well, the way we can do that is we can just kind of scroll down here to where we see the value of 0. And in fact, this is the value of 0 because of rounding. It's a very small number, but effectively it's 0. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the equal sign to make the value of our second area equal to the value of our first area. Now, if we want the area between 0 and 1, we're going to drag this down so that it includes 0 and 1 and everything in between. And so notice that on our graph, this area is now shaded. And so if we highlight this series, again, we can kind of change the color to whatever we want it to be. Let's say that we wanted to make it gray or something like that. This kind of is a diagram that I think you could use in your homework assignments to indicate which area under the normal curve you're using. Now, this is a flexible kind of approach. So let's say that we didn't want just the area between 0 and 1 standard deviation. Let's say that we wanted the area between -1 standard deviation and 1 standard deviation. Well, how would we do that? Well, the same way that we've been doing it. So we basically take this value, put our cursor somewhere in the lower right-hand corner of this box, and we're going to drag up from a value of 0 to a value of -1. And now we can see that we have both a negative and a positive area under the normal curve. Now, the problem here is that when we're doing these exercises, we don't typically start with standard deviation units. We're typically given some normal curve that has some mean and some standard deviation. Well, the nice thing about this setup is that we can actually change these values. So let's say that we wanted to change this so it had a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 5. Well, we can do that. And everything, because of the way it's set up, everything proportionally changes to that. And so now, let's say that we wanted to fill in a different area. What we could do is we could return these back to their original zeros. So if I click in one of the zeros and I just drag it down to overwrite these, I'm back to my original graph. And let's say, for example, that I wanted to figure out the area under the curve corresponding to an area of 18 or higher. Well, how would I do that? Well, I scroll down here where I see 18, and I see 18 is 1.6 standard deviations above the mean. And I'm just going to take this area, and I'm going to say that the 0 is going to be equal to this area. And I'm going to drag this down all the way to 3.5 standard deviations, or a value of 27.5. And you can see that that's the area that Excel shades on my graph. And so using this, you can basically shade any area under the normal curve corresponding to a normal distribution with any mean and any standard deviation. All of these things are customizable and changeable. So this is a nice general approach to creating diagrams in Excel that show different areas under the normal curve.